Hey everyone, today we're joined by Rod Dreher, renowned author of The Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, and his latest work, Living in Wonder. Rod has long explored the cultural and spiritual crises facing Christians in a rapidly changing world. In our conversation, we delve into the historical roots of disenchantment, the rise of the occult, and the emerging religion of Silicon Valley with its techno-optimism and transhumanist aspirations. Together we discuss what it will take for Christians to rediscover reality in its fullness, a reality filled with wonder, grounded in Christ, and alive with a renewed sense of enchantment. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for tuning in. Hey Rod, so how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I just arrived at Amsterdam for the weekend, here for an Ideas Festival, one of my favorite towns.
Yeah. How long are you there for?
Oh, just for the weekend, but it's going to be a pretty packed weekend of talking about ideas and art and beauty, and with a lot of really smart people. I don't know how they let me in, but they did, and I'm grateful for it.
That's awesome. You know, I think we were together a little over a month ago in Chicago, and I mean, this has been a crazy month for you with releasing Living in Wonder. Are any highlights from that, the feedback you've been getting?
You know, I've had stellar reviews, which is always a good thing when you're a writer. But one of the things that really jumps out at me about the reviews is the reviewers saying that, well, once again, Rod Dreher saw what was coming. He's written a book that's right for the times. And it's gratifying to read that. But it's also gratifying on a more serious level to know that, you know, as a Christian, I'm writing into the things that are really relevant in our time. It's not just we're trying to bring timeless wisdom from the faith to problems and challenges that are actual, that real people are dealing with.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I reread it actually. I was in Baltimore over the weekend and reread it on the plane, and it really is. I mean, for me, it touches a nerve because there was a lot in that felt autobiographical. It felt like you really are getting to something that is in the culture, this whole notion of disenchantment, but this re-enchantment that's happening. I guess one question I had, you know, right off the bat in reading it is, what's the through line between between these three books? Mm-hmm. So, you know, Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, and now Living in Wonder. Is there a central question that kind of orients these? Do you see them as a trilogy? What's the sort of journey the reader goes through in looking at these three books?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I didn't set out to write a trilogy, but that's what has happened. The through line is how to live a faithful Christian life in a post-Christian world. Benedict Option is partly about spirituality, but it's also about community, about morals, things like that, education. It's more general, right? Then Live Not by Lies is about how to handle persecution for the faith. How do you stand up for the truth? What virtues do you need to have to stand up when you have to suffer for it? And this new one, though, Living in Wonder, is probably at the core of all things, because it's about the source of our faith, this visceral encounter with the living God. And it's something that we have lost in modern times. Even many Christians don't really have it. I mean, I tell a story in the first chapter about an evangelical graduate student, American, who approached me in a Hungarian city. He knew my Benedict Option work, and this book hadn't come out then, and obviously. And he said, look, I need to talk to you because I believe it. I'm an evangelical. I know the Bible. I believe it all, but I'm spiritually living in a desert. I need to feel some sense of enchantment. What can you do for me? As a matter of fact, just yesterday in Budapest, he's living there now, he came up to me and said that he's decided to become Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, because he was seeking one of the ancient church for that a more sacramental tradition, a liturgical tradition, because that's what feeds his soul.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I want to dive into this, but I think there is absolutely a sense of we've moved beyond a kind of atheistic, reductionistic worldview, that there seems to be a re-enchantment happening, but I think you really explained pretty well that a lot of this re-enchantment is not a Christian
Right.
re-enchantment. But I there's something happening. But I want to know first, if you could, what is the disenchantment that took place? Like, how did we get from, the experience you had even at Chartres Cathedral, seeing how magnificent that was, and who were people that were able to create such a thing, to this flat, kind of opaque world where we're just bumping into objects? What took place? What was the process of disenchantment? And then, eventually I want to get to what's happening now with this re-enchantment. But
Right.
I think a lot of people don't understand the historical path that the West has gone through.
Yeah, the great Charles Taylor, the religious philosopher, starts his book, A Secular Age, by asking why was it the case that 500 years ago it was difficult to not believe in God, whereas today it's difficult to believe in God. Well, this book talks about the same thing, but I go back a little bit further to say that a theological dispute in the High Middle Ages between the scholastics, this was all within the Catholic Church, of course, between the scholastics and the nominalists, two different philosophical schools, resulted in a victory for the nominalists. Now, it might sound like angels dancing over the head of a pin thing, but what the nominalists did was to say that God's sovereignty means that he can't be found in the material world. The scholastics believed, and I think the Catholic Church still teaches this, that, in some sense, God is present, some mysterious sense, in the material world. The nominalists didn't quite see it that way, but what they were trying to do was to protect God's sovereignty. They didn't want God to be captured in a bunch of doctrines and syllogisms, right? So I understand what they were getting at, but what that ended up doing as it played out over the coming centuries was pushing God steadily, and pushing things of the Spirit steadily farther away from us, until by the time you get through the Reformation and then the Enlightenment, you had the deist who believed in God, but he was far away, like the watchmaker God. And then we move on to the modern world, where God becomes, if we feel him at all, I'm talking about people's general experience, he's a more therapeutic God, the God who is the cosmic butler of moralistic therapeutic deism. I think the ultimate point, though, is this was a long process. It wasn't just a matter of ideas. Technology had a lot to do with it, with pushing us in towards disembodiment. That's the key thing. Where and Marshall McLuhan, I say this in the book, the great Catholic media scholar Marshall McLuhan, who was a daily mass goer, he said that religion is primarily percept. That is something that you perceive with your body.
Yeah.
And when it becomes concept, that is when you capture it in propositions and ideas, we have to have that to talk about God. But if it gets stuck there in this disembodied, abstracted way, and we lose the broader and deeper contact with God through our bodies and through our senses, then the faith can begin to die.
I think that's right. One of the things I thought really interesting is the way you bring in the whole term of resonance. So enchantment as resonance, this idea that when we encounter something in the world, the objective world, there's a way in which it lights us up inside. There's a kind of correspondence almost between, and I suppose that's what the nominalists were going after as well. The universal, for them, was not our participation in the actual object. It was just a kind of name that we're giving something, so that it creates a world outside of us that's almost self-sufficient, and we have no real connection with that.
Right.
Which creates this whole split between the supernatural and the natural, which is really produced, I think, terrible consequences. But could you share a little bit more of this whole concept of resonance? I know McLuhan talks about that as well, but I found that to be one of the more helpful ways into thinking about what enchantment is.
Yeah, me too. I didn't know about this guy who came up with that, Hartmut Rosa, R-O-S-A. He's a German sociologist. But when I read his book, he did a short book about explaining the concept, it really made sense to me. Basically, he says that, and his is not a religious book, I should say. He says that it's a common human experience when you're especially when you're in the presence of something that fills you with awe. You feel some kind of mysterious, inchoate connection to it. It makes you feel larger than yourself and connected to something deeper. A lot of people have the experience of believing that or sensing that there's something more than just what meets the eye. Well, that's resonance. And he says there is a way to find resonance, to be resonant with an object, person, place, or thing. You have to first establish a relationship with it. But when you move, as you move closer and closer to try to master the thing, to try to gain control of it, you lose resonance, or you lose enchantment. To Wordsworth had this, the poet Wordsworth had this great line, "We murder to dissect." And what he meant by that was we take the life out of something mysterious in our efforts to tear it apart, to find out how this works. This is the Western mind. We're so uncomfortable with mystery. We want to break things down into its parts to explain the mechanism there. If that's your mindset, you cannot find resonance and you cannot find enchantment. A thing that you can fully understand and fully control, you cannot feel resonant with, and you can't be enchanted by it.
You talk a little bit about the Renaissance, and I was in Rome, I guess 3 weeks ago, and I've been there, before, but I think one of the things that really stood out to me was just the sheer, just the amount of art, and it's very beautiful, and far be it for me to critique it. But one of the things I noticed in my own sense of my relationship to it was, you have let's say like the Risen Christ by Michelangelo, and it's a beautiful piece of art. But I found myself very much, I sort of stopped there. It was a very sort of humanistic Christ. He's very sort of muscular. There was a celebration of the human, and then you go over to like San Clemente in the Tree of Life, the mosaic on the back, which is not trying to give human proportions. There was something almost something that was mysterious about it. It was not. It wasn't reducing. I don't want to say it was reducing, but it was less trying to be realistic and much more about something that was kind of coming through. This whole
something
notion of an
implicit,
icon,
right?
That's right. And I'm wondering if I've become very interested in icons lately, and even the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Just looking at the art from the Middle Ages as opposed to what took place in the Renaissance. What happened there from your perspective? And as beautiful, as majestic as the Renaissance was, is there something disenchanting about that whole movement that led us into this kind of secularism where we lost access to what's supposed to come from the other side of the piece of artwork that's supposed to, there's I don't know if there's something you could share on that. It just affected me deeply in Rome. Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, and having been an Eastern Orthodox Christian for the last 18 years and having using icons in worship at home and in the liturgy, I've had to learn what icons mean to an Eastern Christian. And they're seen as windows into heaven, windows into the transcendent. They're not meant to be realistic. They're meant to suggest the saint or Christ or the Holy Virgin, the figures who were there, but they don't want you to think of it as realistic. And I think that's because they don't want your eye to stop there. I think that's what you're talking about, Tim, that our eyes, the art of the Renaissance is so humanistic and gloriously so, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But your eye does stop there. All art, at least in the Eastern Orthodox understanding, all visual art, all art at all is only valuable insofar as it points us toward God or allows us to experience spiritual reality. So I felt that when I first became Orthodox, I found the Byzantine iconographic tradition to be a little bit rigid. I couldn't relate to it. But once my eyes, so to speak, got used to it, I was drawn into it was like I was being drawn into the painting, the icon, and your eye really does go through it. But you have to learn how to see in that way. It's not just there as decoration to remind you of holy things, but it's meant to be an object of worship as a window, not an object. I should clarify. It's not meant to be an object that one worships as one worships God, but you use it in worship as a sacramental to draw you closer to an experience of the Holy Spirit.
I think that's it seems to get to the heart of what the book is about, which is a way of seeing, kind of recovering something. And it's true even in the Western Church. I look at old Irish illuminated manuscripts. It's not realistic. There's something that's being conveyed through the vibrancy of the colors and the patterns. I wonder if there's something that in that form of art that is teaching us how to see, and even seeing the natural world that way. A tree is not a tree. There's something, a poet sees a lot more, and there's something that's been lost in our, to your point with McLuhan, percept versus concept, the ability to perceive reality in this much fuller way. But something took place. One of the weirdest paradoxical things which you note in the book is that you have this Enlightenment, you have the scientific revolution, you have the total destruction of Christian enchantment which takes place, but simultaneous to that, you have the return of a kind of pagan sort of occult practice. So you have Isaac Newton, who's as interested in alchemy as he is with chemistry. You got John Dee, the astronomer. You've got the recovery of the corpus hermeticum. What is going on in the dawn of the modern age, where you have a kind of destruction of Christian enchantment, you have the rise of rationalism, but then you have this very strange emergence of the occult? And what is that? What is that in relationship to Christian enchantment, this kind of darker form of enchantment, and why does it come in right at the rise of science, the rise of a new obsession with technology?
Well, I think because what they were trying to do back then was what is properly called magic, as opposed to religion. Magic is a way of using a ritual to try to get what you want. It's a technique, right, to learn how to control the world. Religion, Christian religion anyway, it's not about that. It's not about controlling these forces to make them do what you want. It's about recognizing and living within the sovereignty of God. An exorcist I interviewed in the Vatican explained it this way. He said, when people call on demons, they'll come. They'll come every time. People want them to do things for them, and they may put on a show of doing things for you, but it's all to enslave you. God doesn't work that way. God cannot be controlled. Look, let's go back to Acts 19, right? Simon the magician, he's newly baptized as a Christian. He sees the apostles working wonders, and he wants to buy them, right? And buy their power so he can use it himself. And St. Peter famously rebukes him and says, that's not how God works, And well, that's the difference between magic and religion. And I think at the dawn of the scientific era, they still had enough of a sense of mystery, and the early the alchemists, where they thought that they could bring on some kind of powers to increase man's power over the natural world. Alchemy was just another way, a sort of spiritualized way of technology, trying to use technology. And but you can't, and that's the thing too, Tim, you can't get rid of the hunger for enchantment. It's just the way we're made. Nobody is satisfied ultimately with atheist materialism.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say so this kind of enchantment, which is magic, which is the exertion of our will over a quote unquote dead matter, it kills resonance though, doesn't it? Because if you're no longer, what you just said is that resonance decreases the more we want to control it. So the more you want to control it, it's almost like this hopeless quest in this dark enchantment to control, but in so doing you're left with nothing but this kind of impoverished hunger, which is not going to be satisfied through however much you can manipulate things to get what you want. It's really tragic.
Yeah, that's right. One of the heroes of my book is Ian McGilchrist. He is a British psychiatrist who's written a lot about the connection between brain hemisphere and the development of culture. And to simplify his theory, we all know that the left brain is where abstraction and scientific thinking happens. The right brain is more intuitive, emotional, and perceptive. McGilchrist says that in a healthy brain, you take in sensual input. It goes from your right brain, sends it over to the left for analysis, and then reintegrates it with the right brain to form a picture of the world. The problem with the West in the last 500 years, says McGilchrist, is that we've gotten stuck in the left brain. At the dawn of the modern era, the scientific age, we began to privilege a left brain way of seeing the world. We began to think that scientific reasoning, abstraction, was a more reliable path to the truth. This guy, Yuval Noah Harari, this contemporary atheist intellectual, he has a really pithy phrase to describe what happened at the early dawn of the early modern era. We exchanged meaning for power. That is to say, if we evacuated all spirit and meaning and logos from the natural world, from the material world, then we could do whatever we wanted to with it. And there's a direct line, I believe, between that idea emerging in the early modern era and transhumanism today, and transgenderism for that matter. The idea that there is no meaning inherent in biology, and it's just meat that we can do with what we want.
Right. I mean, I think you quote Jacques Ellul as well, and I was wanted to read this because it was really chilling about this whole question of technique. And you quote him as technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency in every field of human activity. And when technique enters into every area of life, including the human, it ceases to be external to man and becomes his very substance. That's very, I think that's what's happened, but that's pretty chilling when it's become our very substance. We can't see, we lose the human for, I guess we're so lost in the left brain that we lose the essence of what it is to be human, and we see increasingly a society of control, of surveillance, a more machine-like. I don't know if you could share more on that. I found that to be particularly it's going to stop me for a while to say, yikes.
Well, everybody in my intellectual circles are talking about an address that was given recently by a Calvinist lawyer named Jeff Schaefer. And you can find the address on the Substacks of N.S. Lyons, Lyons, and also Matthew B. Crawford. He gave it at a conference, and Schaefer, who's done a lot of work in religious liberty over the years, I got to know him when he was at the Alliance Defending Freedom. He talks about what artificial reproductive technology is doing to the human. And he makes a case that by turning the production of babies over to a pure scientific technique, we're demolishing the natural family, because a baby can end up having, different parents, a gestating mother who's different, the mother or father who's bought the baby. What does that say about the natural family? Schaefer says the ultimate end of this is the family ceases to exist, the human ceases to exist, because to be human is to exist in relation to other people. And so we all become wards of the state. And this is the kind of thing Ellul was talking about. You've turned men into machines. Interestingly enough, I have, and this is really weird, but I taught this guy Jonah I talked to in the book. He was an ex-occultist who became a Christian. I don't think I quoted him on this in the book, but he told me something that I've heard from other people who've been involved in the occult. They believe that the alien phenomena, UAPs, UFOs, are really demons, high-level demons whose ultimate goal is to merge man with the machine as a way of destroying humanity. Now, when Jonah told me, that was the first time I heard it, I thought, well, that's weird. But then I kept hearing it, and then I came to understand that, whether it may or may not be true, but this is what these people say. This is about the abolition of man, the extermination of humanity by eliminating our humanness, and we're going along with it because we think that by turning our bodies into like machines, treating them like mechanical parts, we are exercising control over it. We are imposing our will. We're advancing our freedom. In a political sense, too. I mean, Patrick Deneen wrote that great book, Why Liberalism Failed. And he said in the book, the argument is that liberalism as a political philosophy, he's not talking about the philosophy of the Democratic Party, but the philosophy that has led Western politics for the last 250 years. He said it's all about emancipating the choosing individual, empowering the choosing individual such that he does not feel bound by any unchosen restraints. So here we are. You cannot have an enchanted world like that, and you can't even have a human world.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Aleister Crowley, with the Book of the Law, what does he say? The summation of the laws, do what thou wilt. Yeah. And his whole system was to engage in various practices, sort of spiritual technologies to exert power. And if that then, how is that any different than a conception of freedom as do what thou wilt? I mean, or one of the things that I found really, disturbing in the last, 10, 20 years was the sort of popularization of certain occult practices and things like The Secret, where you engage in a kind of technique, imaginative technique, to manifest your desires. And it was sort of popularized by people like Oprah, and it was seen as this sort of, kind of a new age spirituality. But I saw it, in my time working as an actor and a lot of people, this is kind of the religion of Hollywood. I mean, there's no question that this is a real religious movement, and people are practicing this and doing disciplines to things that were part of occult practices for, thousands of years. They're engaging in kind of a pagan way to exert one's will, one's desire on reality. And it seems like with modern technology and where it's going, we're now in a position where we're able to do that to such a chilling extent that we are in that stage of the abolition of man. This is what the transhuman thing is all about. So I just feel like where we are at right now is a kind of pivotal moment to say, are we going to keep doing? I mean, you call it a kind of Tower of Babel moment. Yeah. And where does it go? Where does it go from here?
Man, that's the big question. I think we're nowhere near the end of this. As you and I are talking, just yesterday, there were more UAP hearings on Capitol Hill in a House subcommittee, and you had government people saying, no, the U.S. government knows a lot more about these UAPs than they're letting on. And one of the things I learned about this in researching this, I didn't even care about UFOs. I thought it was silly. When I first started writing about it, I thought that my understanding of UFOs was stuck in the first season of the X-Files, right? But then a friend of mine who covers the Vatican, he's a really serious Catholic, he said, listen, I know you laugh at this, but you better take it seriously because there's some serious spiritual stuff going on there. Well, what I found out was that, yeah, he's right. There's a lot going on there. A lot of people high up in the national security and defense field pay attention to it, as does Silicon Valley. Here's the crazy thing. Almost none of them believe these are creatures from other planets. They believe they are extra-dimensional or interdimensional beings. You'll notice if you saw any of the hearings on Capitol Hill yesterday, one of the congressmen asked a witness, Louis Elizondo, who was an insider, who was trying to protect whistleblowers. He said, do you think these are interdimensional beings? He didn't answer the question. He said, well, I'm not in a position to say.
Yeah.
And, and it's a crazy thing to be talking about. But, Tim, we've got to talk about it. I noticed that today neither the New York Times nor the Washington Post had anything about these hearings. And it's the biggest story out there. And if I want my readers to take away from the book, if you sit there like I was a year before I finished the book, just sitting there laughing at this stuff, you're going to really miss some hugely important religious things going on, because this is actually emerging as a new religion. I talked to a journalist who's working on a secular journalist working on a big piece about UFO cults, and he told me, it's coming out early next year, he told me that it just blows his mind as someone who's not religious. He would go to Washington to talk to people high up in the government about this. They all believe it. And he said they all told him these are extra-dimensional beings trying to make contact with us. And the journalist said, well, why haven't you told people this when you've been interviewed? He said, we have told them. They haven't reported it.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that.
You talk about Jacques Valet, who studied this his whole career. And, I mean, could you say a little bit more about him? Because there's serious people. I think that thing, it's been seen as a kind of crackpot thing and just fantasy, but it's clearly not. And you have serious people like Valet who I think, correct me if I'm wrong, his theory is exactly that these are interdimensional beings.
Valet is a really interesting figure. If you saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the unnamed French scientist played by Francois Truffaut is based on Jacques Valet. He's a Frenchman. He's in his 80s now, lives in San Francisco. He made his money as working with the early internet. He's a computer scientist, but he's really interested in UFOs and has been for many decades, wanting to know what's at the bottom of this mystery. He's not a Christian at all, but as far back as 1969, he wrote this book called Passport to Magonia, in which he floated the theory that what we call aliens are actually spiritual entities that are manifesting in this particular form now because that's how they can dazzle and be taken seriously by people raised in a scientific and technological age, whereas in ages past they might have appeared as trolls or whatever. And Valet, Diana Pasulka, she's somebody who's really interesting to read on this. She's a Catholic religious studies professor in North Carolina. She talks about going to visit Jacques at his apartment, his penthouse in San Francisco, and being shocked by seeing he had a big bookshelf full of books about angels and demons, which she didn't expect in a man who is not a Christian. And then he showed her a book and said, you need to read this, so get yourself a copy because it'll help you understand what we're dealing with here. The title of the book was Satan, and it was a collection of theological essays, mostly by Catholic priests, published by a Carmelite publishing house sometime in the mid-20th century. Jacques seems to believe, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he seems to believe that whatever this really is, it is behind all this, it is Luciferian. And it definitely does not mean us well.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a connection between what people are experiencing in these reports of encounters with UFOs, and you read some of the sort of way in which people have related psychedelic experiences, and Terence McKenna in the 90s talking about the mechanical elves that he would encounter, and even different psychedelics bringing about different types of experiences. So ayahuasca tends to be somewhat of an encounter with a feminine presence. I think psilocybin tends to be these kind of mechanical elves. What are these sort of portals into these dimensions? Like, is there a connection between this UFO world, or even Aleister Crowley, the way he would? There's a depiction of this demon or this being, and it looks very much like a UFO.
Yeah, land.
What is all this, and is there a connection between these things? Are these portals? Are these thin places where we're encountering this other world?
Right. Well, I think so. I talk in the book about psychedelic drugs making the psyche more porous to outside influences, because in the modern world especially, but also just a normal human being has certain buffering to experience. But when you take psychedelics, and I say this as someone who experimented with them in college many years ago before I became a Christian, they really work. They make you so much more sensitive to other realities. Now, I never did anything as strong as DMT or the other things that are really sending people on a rocket ship to another dimension. But in fact, using LSD in college awakened me to the presence of God. I've hesitated to talk about that over the years because I don't want people at all to think, oh, do this and you'll meet God. I just think I got really lucky that the Holy Spirit protected me in that. But it did sort of turn me inside out and help me realize that my depression that I was experiencing then was just about being stuck in my head. It awakened me to a direct experience of God's presence in this beautiful world. But I think that these things are so dangerous because they do open up portals. And once you open that door, you don't know what's coming through it. These heavy psychedelics people use now, and I have some testimony on this in the book, they're going to other realms. This fellow Jonah, the name I give him, he's a scholar, a PhD, who was heavily involved in the occult worship. He said he allowed himself to be possessed on a number of occasions within occult worship. I met him through his exorcist. But he finally left and became a Christian when he realized he was dealing with demons, not ancient gods. Well, psychedelics were a huge part of his experience, and he's extremely harsh about warning people, do not open these doors because something's going to come through. Now, I don't know what the connection is between UFOs and psychedelics. It may be there, but I'm not aware of it. But ultimately, it's all a great spiritual deception. People would laugh at us for saying that. Might laugh at me for saying something like that. But go sit down and talk to people who've lived it and who've come out of it. And you can't shake them from it. Once they've had these experiences that have absolutely changed their lives, It scared the hell out of him, literally.
You relate that experience. I think you it was a Chicago lawyer. It was one of the first stories you share in the book about this guy who had these UFO experiences, and then didn't you recommended he get an exorcism? It was really
he didn't know what to do with it. The guy reached out to me on Twitter because I'd been tweeting about spirituality, UFOs, and he was a follower of mine on Twitter, and he said, I need to talk to you. So we set up a Zoom call, and he said that when he was a totally normal guy, very conservative looking, actually, identified as a conservative Catholic. He said that when he was a teenager in 2009, he was driving down a country road and saw a giant spacecraft, what looked like a spacecraft, hovering over a field. He pulled over and stared at it and then drove on and told no one. He said, I didn't want people to think I was crazy. 7 years pass, and he's sitting in his home, in his kitchen, studying for law school. A portal opens up on the wall of his kitchen, and through it, two humanoid beings made of flowing light shimmered through, and he said they began communicating with me telepathically, but it was nothing important. It was things like a car is about to backfire on the street. Then that happened. They were sort of establishing their bona fides. Then they went away. He got scared, went to the hospital, demanded an MRI, demanded blood test. He was fine. These things kept coming back after that. And then when he eventually got married, his wife saw them too. So it wasn't just in his head. And I remember asking him, did you ever pray in front of them? You're a Catholic. Did you pray? Well, yeah. What happened? They went away. Well, did that not make you think there might be demonic? He said, I never thought of it that way. I figured if they were demons, they would want to fight me. I said, no, actually, there's literature. Exorcists have literature of this sort of thing happening to people. I don't think you should tell your priest, because that was his main question. How do I break this to my priest without him thinking I'm crazy? I said, you should call the archdiocesan exorcist, which he did. They stopped. I ran into him recently when I was back in the U.S. We were in the same city. I called him up and said, how you doing? He said, great. Thank you so much for doing that. These things stopped when the exorcist prayed over me. And these things thought they were going to drive me far from Christ, but they've driven me closer to Christ. Now, that's the first story in my book, Tim, as you know. And I throw it out there straight up to help the reader understand that these crazy things are happening, both good and bad. The second story is a beautiful story of release from drug abuse by a miracle. But these are actually happening, but people are so afraid to talk about them that they keep them to themselves.
Do you think that this is more common? There's just a kind of way in which societal pressures keep people from sharing it because they don't want to be seen as crazy. But this is, it sounds like, as a journalist, you've talked to a lot of people, and somebody shares a story, and then somebody says, well, actually, you know what, I actually had something like that. Is your sense that this is much more widespread than commonly reported?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And people tell these things to me because they know I'm not going to judge them. I mean, I may not believe them completely, or I might think there's a natural cause for it, but I'm not going to think they're crazy right off the bat. And I think this is a problem in the West, in the modern West. If you talk to missionaries who've served in Africa or Latin America or other parts of the world, this stuff is everywhere because it's more accepted. I remember when I first was becoming a Catholic back in 1991, I went to this elderly Irish priest in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I was living. And he was just telling me about his life. And he started out as a missionary priest in Africa. And he said that on his first day, he went out on the rounds with this older missionary priest. And they were walking down a path, and nothing was in front of them, but they hit this invisible wall that they couldn't pass by. And it freaked the young guy out. The old guy didn't even flinch. He took out his holy water, threw it on the invisible wall, said a prayer, and they passed through. And they went to a village, preached the gospel, and the people became Christian. And they had found out afterward that a witch doctor, a shaman or whatever, had known that they were coming and had cast a spell over that place. Now, this old Irish priest is like straight out of the movies. He had the shoe-polished black hair. He had died. But him conveying even... Gosh, this must have been at least 50 years after that experience, sitting there in the rectory in Baton Rouge, just shaking his head about how the world was so much stranger than he thought in County Tipperary growing up.
Yeah. Do you? I mean, is there a sense that the world that our ancestors described? So, and, you mentioned the old Irish priest, but it brings to mind the old Irish fairies or these holy wells. There were places where supernatural things took place, and we look back from the perspective of rationalism and say, well, these were just simple people who had crazy imaginations. But as you look at this, what's the connection between these kind of particular places having that kind of do you go back to that word resonance? Is there something? Is there something there? Is there something that we don't have access to because of being stuck in the left brain, where people a couple hundred years ago were actually experiencing real encounters with entities? With I wonder about that, because maybe they weren't so naive. Maybe they actually had a different set of eyes than we have, and we're the ones who just can't see it anymore. I don't know.
Yeah. I went to Ireland researching this book to stay with the writer Paul Kingsnorth. He lives in rural West Country Ireland, and I was staying in a bed in his outbuilding office, and he had on the bedside a book called The Secret Commonwealth. Have you heard of that book?
I haven't heard it.
I think it was an 18th century book. A Scottish clergyman traveled around to the rural areas in Scotland, and I think Ireland too, collecting tales of the little people and the fairies and all that. He just wrote them down, and it's considered to be an all-time classic of the study of myth. But these people did see them. And I think we probably, being unwilling to believe in them, weirdly enough, inhibits our vision. I tell a story in the book about this linguist, Daniel Everett. He was a missionary, a Protestant missionary down in the Amazon jungle. And in his memoir about that, he writes about one morning, he was living there with his family. He and his little girl were awakened by the natives rushing down to the riverbank. They were shouting and pointing at a sandbar. And Everett and his daughter go out there and are like, well, what's going on? What's going on? They don't see anything. And all the natives are like, can't you see it? And they name the demon it is who's standing there cursing them. And Everett ends up saying in the end, he goes, years passed, I got a divorce, I lost my faith, I'm an atheist now, but I still don't know what happened there on that riverbank. I don't know if they were hallucinating and having a mass hallucination, or my daughter and I, as Westerners, just couldn't see what they could see. And I think it's a question we need to be asking. I remember one of the men I talked to in the book, an exorcist, a Catholic exorcist, grew up in Ireland. And he told me stories. I don't know if I put them in the book. I don't think I have. But he told me stories about how he actually heard the banshee one night.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, of course, he believes that this is something demonic. But he doesn't laugh at it. He's like, no, this is real. This is real.
Mm-hmm. So what does that say to you about, clearly with psychedelics, something has opened up where you're experiencing more of reality than you're commonly habituated to sort of let through your filter, I suppose. What does that say? Like, what is it that has actually? I guess the question is, how weird is reality? What is the imagination? How impoverished is our current vision? So if all this, all of the stuff that we've written off as just the wild imaginations of simpler people, if we're the ones who are impoverished, how is it that we have filtered out so much? And is that just part of the disenchantment process, going back to what you had said about McGilchrist about left brain thinking? Is that really it, that we start to process reality in this limited way, and we're just all of a sudden unable to see what's before our face, what's before our nose?
You see what you allow yourself to see, or what you're prepared to see. We've all had the experience, I'm not talking about the supernatural here, but the experience of wondering how it is that the people around us can't see what's obviously happening. I mean, that happened in my own family. I remember trying to warn my mother and father about someone who was clearly trying to take advantage of them. I mean, absolutely clear. I had evidence for it, but they couldn't see it because they could not make sense in their framework of understanding the world that this kindly country woman could do something like that. Now, that's a really ordinary way of doing it, but I think the same thing applies to the supernatural. That if we don't have a framework for it, we either don't see it or we dismiss it. A friend of mine in Budapest just had last night, actually, a priest come over and bless her apartment. She's a fallen away Catholic, and she told me that after she started reading Living in Wonder, things started happening in her apartment, and scary things. And she said that the fact of the matter is, she said, my brother, he's a practicing Catholic. We went to visit a cemetery, and we both got scared because we, at the same time, felt this really dark, malignant presence there. My dog started barking like crazy at nothing, so we left. Ever since then, I've had this sense that there is something in my apartment watching me. But she said, I pushed it out of my head because I thought that's nonsense. I'm just scared for no reason. But after I started reading your book, the thing began to be stronger and stronger and stronger. And so she ended up having the priest come over. But she told me at the end, she said, I'm really glad for all this because I've started going back to Mass now. And you've awakened me. The encounter with the darkness and the reality of this awakened her to how much she needed Christ. And so good came out of it in the end.
Yeah. So with this, because it seems that we are, there's no question in my mind that we have reached the end of the kind of Enlightenment project. We're certainly in the cusp of kind of maybe an in-between phase, and what's coming next isn't entirely clear. But I was really curious in your book how you talk about how so many people in Silicon Valley are engaged in kind of strange practices. How some of the accounts you talk about with, some questions you pose about, is AI, could it possibly be a kind of new sort of, oracle? Is it a kind of I Ching in a way where we don't really know how it works? And there's some really strange reporting of conversations people have had with this technology. Yeah. I'm just curious about this whole re-enchantment that's taking place, specifically around these new forms of technology and a kind of like a new religion almost around this transhuman, techno-optimistic, technological society. That to me it's disenchantment doesn't seem like the problem anymore. It's a kind of weird re-enchantment, but in a potential, in an anti-human way. But they try to tell you that you're becoming more than human. You're exercising your own will. I tell a story in the book about it was a pivotal moment in my research when, at a conference in Oxford in 2022, a young Anglican seminarian approached me and said, listen, I've got to tell you something. I'm in my mid-50s. He said, your generation thinks that the problem is atheism. It's not the problem anymore, not for my generation. He was 27. He said, nobody cares about atheism anymore. I said, so what's the problem? He said, the occult. And he went on to talk about how the church leaders and parents don't understand how thoroughly soaked in the occult youth culture is, and how young people are desperate for some sense of adventure, some sense of visceral spirituality, of mystery, of magic, and all that they're giving themselves over to that, often in conjunction with psychedelic drugs. He told me, he said, I know that when I become ordained, I'm going to have to be dealing with this for the rest of my career, but your generation has no idea what's happening right now. And I later found some social science reporting that validated what this young man was saying. The point is this: re-enchantment is coming at us hard and fast, whether we want it or not. Now, there are, as you mentioned, Tim, a lot of people out in Silicon Valley who believe that AI is some sort of high-tech Ouija board through which higher entities are contacting us to bring us to enlightenment. That's the view. I mean, it's almost like something out of a mythology book, but that's what they think. But even if you don't believe that, there are people who are starting to treat AI, and I think this is going to continue, as a sort of God. They may think it's entirely material, but if you ask this thing that has this entity, this mechanical entity that has more intelligence than any one person ever could, if you ask it for advice, what exactly is the difference between that and a deity? If you come to outsource all of your thinking and reasoning to this thing, thing that cannot fail, it's purely rationalistic, and these things are going to be seen as oracles, I think. But we're going to tell ourselves that, there's no woo behind it, there's no mystical mumbo jumbo. This is science, but it will be like a god. It's very chilling. I mean, again, you talk about McLuhan and McLuhan's notion of technology as extensions of the human senses. So, the wheel is an extension of the foot. The clothes really are an extension of skin. But with AI, it's as if it's an extension of our own mind, our own consciousness, but now it's outside of us, and I find it very. So I'll use ChatGPT, and it's unbelievable. I remember the first time I used it, I asked it to write some essay comparing two thinkers, and I got chills because I thought I would never see anything like this in my life. I always thought the intellectual life was somehow protected. I thought we'd see robots and maybe we'd see driverless cars, but something like this, it was like a bolt of lightning where I thought we're now in a real new era. And it's been every new version of ChatGPT is getting smarter and better. So what's that going to do to us? What kind of as we outsource that level of work, what happens to us? I find that one to be really kind of stops me in my tracks.
Well, we cease to be able to think and to reason and to feel if we've outsourced it to a machine. Right. We all have friends who are college professors who are dealing with this all the time. The kids don't know how to write papers. They turn to ChatGPT, and college professor friends of mine say you feel like you're fighting a losing battle, that there's no way to tell, or it's really difficult to tell. But what's happening to the kids, they just want to get a good grade without having to work for it. They come out of college not knowing how to reason, how to think, and they lose a part of their humanity. In the end, the sort of thing that these occult weirdos say that the aliens are trying to do, merge man with the machine to kill humanity. Well, there you go. If you have to depend on asking a machine, AI, to do even simple tasks or to figure simple things out, what is that? How does that stunt your mind and your soul? There's a story I mentioned in the book about a company that's doing an AI company that's doing a pilot program in Florida, I think it is, with 7-year-olds. They're pairing 7-year-olds in the experiment with an AI that will follow them throughout life. It'll be like the cosmic familiar, or a butler who's always there he knows everything about you, and he's going to be there. He knows you better than you know yourself. Well, how horrifying is that? When a machine knows you better than you know yourself, who is actually the master and who is the servant?
Right. It's like a kind of perverse anti-guardian angel almost. It's a very strange concept. McLuhan, you mentioned this too. McLuhan was very, in his own public writings, he didn't want to make any real value judgments on what electronic, and again, he died before the rise of the internet, but he didn't want to make any value judgments publicly. But then privately, you read what he thought about electronic communication, and he says it's a kind of facsimile of the mystical body of Christ and has all of the earmarkings of the Antichrist. And I suppose that's because it destroys the body. It destroys the whole, the Incarnation is this God becomes flesh in a particular place. And what does this stuff do? It completely divorces us from our body, our lived experience. I don't know, anything you can say on that? Because there is something about this where we are, McLuhan's, the more I think about it, it is a kind of image of what is promised to us in the mystical body, but it doesn't deliver. It's just...
the digital has a metaphysics, and metaphysics teaches us implicitly that reality is ultimately abstract, that we can do anything we like with the material world, in the way that the digital world formats us to imagine all things as just particles. I think it's that can be in bits of information that can be taken apart and reformulated. I think it's not a coincidence at all that transgenderism has really taken off in the first generation raised entirely online. I think this is just part of their formatting. I tell a story in the book, Tim, as you know, about an argument I got into on a trip to Turkey a couple of years ago. It was a press trip to the 7 Churches of Revelation. Really interesting trip. One of the journalists on there was a Protestant guy. I think he was some sort of charismatic, perhaps, I'm not sure. But he brought his virtual reality headset with him on the trip so he could go to church in the metaverse. And we started talking about it. What is that like? And he would get together with people all around the world at the same time, and then their virtual bodies inside this thing. They would have church. And he thought this is the future of religion. He said, I'm like, no, it's not. Come on. I mean, and he didn't know any Catholics or Orthodox. And so I was trying to explain to him the sacramental principle, why this will never work. But it just made him angry because I was devaluing his experience. For him, religion and worship was only about hearing a message and having an emotional experience, which you can do in virtual reality. But in the stuff I was telling him about sacramentalism and holiness and the Eucharist and all that, had no clue what I was talking about. And that taught me, though, that if this is the future of religion, then we're not going to be religious. Because once you divorce worship from using the body, your traditions become very, very fragile.
It seems like it's a new opportunity to explain like the sacraments, though. For me, it's been seeing what, thinking of digital technology and the forms of connectivity that it offers in juxtaposition to sacramental life. I understand the sacraments in a much deeper way, which is this kind of it's the extension of the Incarnation, where we participate in the offer. God's offer to participate in the divine life, but through the body. It's through the sacraments are this embodied form of participation that absolutely require us to participate with our bodies in a particular place in a particular time. That, I wonder, is a kind of opportunity for a Christian re-enchantment to reintroduce. Yeah, we got to get back to reality, and that part of being in touch with reality is owning the fact that we are embodied beings. Which you touch on in the book when we get to the point of how do we get back to a Christian form of enchantment. I'd be curious to, just in terms of some of the ways, how can we, in this particular context, facing some of these really bizarre challenges, how do we get back to real Christian enchantment?
Well, a couple things. The historian Tom Holland, who a lot of Christians have read, his book Dominion, about how Christianity shaped the Western world. He recently gave a talk in London that went around the internet, in which he said that the church should lean heavily into the supernatural aspect of its teachings, because that's the only thing that exists in the church and nowhere else in the world. He's not saying at the expense of the other the works of mercy, things like that, but he said emphasize this. People are hungry for it, and I think that we need to do that as a general rule, but specifically. I talk about enchantment is not like you follow a 5-point plan, presto changeo, enchantment. It doesn't work that way. You learn how to be enchanted in the same way that like you learn how to play the violin. It's a steady deepening of experience and an opening of one's eyes. There's a quote that a Harvard professor said, talking about education. She said that education is not the passing of information from teacher to student. Real education is the teacher helping the students to learn how to be staring at the correct corner of the sky when a comet blazes past. And that's enchantment too, right? Yeah. I think so. If we learn to live the sacramental Christian life, going to Mass or liturgy, saying your prayers regularly, fasting, using sacramentals like candles, incense, icons, things like that, they may seem like extraneous to the real business of religion, which is information. No, these things shape us in ways that we're not often aware of until much later. But anything we can do to bring the body into worship that will so strengthen our faith, it will not only enchant us, but it will strengthen our faith. I like to quote this Cambridge University cultural anthropologist, Paul Connerton, who was studied at one point how small traditional communities hold on to their traditions in the face of modernity, which annihilates all of them. And he said they had several things in common. One, they had a sacred story that they held in common that told them who they are and what they're to do. Second, they celebrate this sacred story in an unvarying ritual. Third, the ritual, they believe, took them in some mysterious sense out of time. And finally, this is so important, they use the body in the celebration of the sacred story, because using the body in worship sediments the sacred story into their bones. What a beautiful phrase. And when I read that, I'd already been an Orthodox Christian for maybe 10 years and had been Catholic for 13 years before that. I thought, there you have it. That's liturgical sacramental Christianity right there.
Right, right. Yeah, it gets out of this whole idea that first you've got to come up with the right idea, and then you work it all out in your head, and then maybe you'll fall to your knees. It's actually the very opposite of that. It's first you participate with the body, and then this whole world opens up for you. It's a real reversal of, I suppose, the way faith has been conceived, especially at least since the Reformation, which has been
absolutely.
much more of an intellectual. Yeah.
When I became Orthodox in 2006, I remember asking the priest, all right, so what do I need to know to be Orthodox? Give me some books. He's like, well, I can give you a list of books, but that's not how you do it. I went, well, what do you mean? Yeah. I thought all I had to do was read the doctrine, read the theology, I agree with it, boom, I'm in. He said, it's going to take you about 10 years to become Orthodox. I'm like, what do you mean? I've been chrismated. He said, no. Being an Orthodox Christian is embedding, or well, he didn't use these words, but sedimenting into your bones the way of life of being an Orthodox Christian. You learn so much more simply by showing up faithfully on Sunday and on feast days, keeping the fast and so on and so forth. I didn't understand what he meant, but now that I've been Orthodox for 18 years, I get exactly what he meant. What I was doing was coming at it, Tim, from a Western mindset, which says that true knowledge is knowledge that's propositional, that's logical. And what the Orthodox were doing is saying it doesn't really work that way. I mean, you do have that part of knowledge, but there's also a way of knowing that's more right-brained, to use Ian McGilchrist's terms, that you learn through participation. Through art and music and liturgy and dance, that sort of thing. It's not an inferior way of knowing. It's a different way of knowing, and it's a way of knowing that we have to tap into again and make our own again if we're ever going to get out of this deep despair and malaise.
I want to be sensitive of your time, but one of the things I found very, very moving, and I know how Dante has been key to you in different times of your life, but you quote Dante quite a bit in terms of this re-enchantment process, and then you say that this regeneration is something that is not something that happens in a single stroke. It's a process. As Dante becomes purer in heart, his ability to perceive God's glory in creation grows, as does his love for God. I suppose that's what you mean in terms of this process. It's not a light switch. It's walking the walk. It all of a sudden you start to see more and more of this glory of God, how is Dante a guide for you in this? I mean, I found that really.
Man, Dante. I wrote a book called "How Dante Can Save Your Life," so that shows you how I think about Dante. What Dante does, Dante the pilgrim, the character in the poem, he is drawn out of misery and despair by beauty, by the beauty of Beatrice. His love, and what she does. The mistake he has made in his life is he loved Beatrice, he loved love and all these things, but he didn't realize that all material beauty is there to point us to God. And by following Beatrice's beauty, the glorified Beatrice, the Beatrice who comes down from heaven to save Dante, to lead him to God, he pursues her beauty, but he has to go through all these purgations of all of his sins, his tendencies to sin. And the more he can be purged, the more light in paradise, the paradiso, the third part of the Divine Comedy, the more light he can contain. Beatrice tells him at one time, if I smiled, the light from my smile would annihilate you because you're not strong enough for it. And so I think one of the big lessons you can take from reading the Divine Comedy is that beauty is a way to enchantment. It redirects our eros, our desire, towards godly things, true beauty. And the more we immerse ourselves in beauty, the more purer our heart becomes, and we become holier if you do it in the right way.
Well, I just found that to be, that is so, we're kind of in this pornified world. And you quote, I was really blown away. Is it Pastistas? He writes, he says, without commitment, without a commitment to chastity, the world cannot remain enchanted for us. If we desecrate our bodies and the bodies of others, nature will hide from us. I found that to be really amazing. I mean, that's this if the beauty that led Dante through his whole journey to the vision of God, if that gets replaced with a kind of I guess an idol where you stop there at the body, or you allow kind of lust to take you over, you can't continue on the journey. You can't. The whole notion of nature hiding from you, you have no access to enchantment. That was really quite interesting, I found. And in does this whole, again, I mean, you've talked about this as well, the way in which the porn industry is just absolutely destroying the souls of so many men. How does that play into disenchantment?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's because it turns us into animals, right? It makes us slaves to our passions. In the Orthodox conception of salvation, as you are being saved, you're becoming more and more free from your passions. The same thing that happens to Dante in the Commedia when he gets to the top of the mountain of purgatory. Virgil says, "I crown and mitre you, master of your soul," meaning not that you don't have desires, but that you've mastered your desires. The Holy Spirit has filled you such that your desires do not control you. Well, porn reverses that. I mean, my God, the things that priests tell me that they hear in confession, and these are from men who at least know it's wrong. I mean, it's defacing the human in all of us, and it makes us see every other person as an object of sexual desire, and that you can use and take into your life and just use them like they're machines. And this is, of course, why you don't have enchantment. As we were talking earlier, if you wish to be enchanted by something, you have to establish a relationship with it, but it has to be a relationship that has some room between you and the other person for the mystery to be there. If you bring a person or a thing under your total control, no enchantment can exist. And that's what porn does.
That's no, I think that's just so important. I guess one last thing would be what you mentioned, Karl Rahner, in that quote that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or he will cease to be. I think that's it's interesting. You kind of end there, and just the importance of a participation in these mysteries rather than a simply cerebral knowledge of theology. Can you? I mean, anything you can share just in terms of why you wanted to end there with this quote from Rahner and why it's so important for us to understand and
because I wanted people, Tim, to not to think that enchantment is just a nice little add-on to the real Christian life. I wanted them to understand that enchantment, in the way I talk about it in the book, and it's a book of Christian enchantment. I'm not talking about just the general phenomenon. It is at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. As an Eastern Orthodox Christian, theosis, that is to be filled with God and changed, that is the ultimate goal of the Christian life, ultimate unity with God. It will happen in the afterlife, but we participated in this life. This is what Dante, the whole journey of Dante through the Inferno, up the mountain of purgatory to the Paradiso, it's all about theosis. So this is not alien to the Catholic tradition either. But to find theosis, you have to have a strong feeling that everything you do in your body is also spiritually important, that matter and spirit interpenetrate. This is a metaphysical reality. It's not just a nice idea, it really happens. And if, following Rahner, if we lose our awareness that we are spiritual beings as well as fleshly beings, and they're tied into each other, and we lose the ability to perceive the movement of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and also evil spirits, I would say, around us, then we will be fundamentally disconnected from reality, and we will be also much more vulnerable to all these false forms of enchantment and dark enchantment. I mean, in my case, I've had mystical experiences all my life, nothing overwhelming like some of the stories in the book, but things that have showed me that God really is everywhere present and fills all things. And it always, whether it's something positive from the Lord, or whether it's an encounter with the demonic that I've had, or with friends of mine who've had it, they always throw me back onto the reality of the Spirit and the primacy of the spiritual world. And it recenters me. I think that's what Rahner meant, that the things that we see in the world of technology are going to be so overwhelming that we will bow down and worship it. We'll be, well, like the Israelites in the desert worship the golden calf. We're going to have to remember that Moses is on the mountain and God is talking to him, and he's coming down to tell us what God is saying. If we don't do that and keep that memory alive within us and that constant experience of the Holy Spirit, then we're done.
Wow. Well, for me personally, it's I think it's absolutely tremendous work. I think it's getting to the heart of where the culture is and where people of faith need to redirect their attention in terms of evangelization, in terms of how to share the gospel. But it brought together so many different strands. So I appreciate just the honesty, just the amount of life you bring to your work, bringing in not only a deep understanding of these philosophical concepts, but also the journalistic angle, bringing in stories. I think it's just so rich. I found it to be, it's the second reading, and I got so much more out of it. So I'm really, really grateful to you for doing this. And I hopefully share it with as many people. It's great to be able to talk to you about it. I'm just grateful to you.
I appreciate the conversation. As you know, Tim, I end the book with the story of a journey I made to Jerusalem for Holy Week. The day before I left for Jerusalem, I was living in Budapest on a fellowship at the time. I got an email from my wife saying she had filed for divorce the day before after 25 years of marriage. And I was shocked because we had never talked about divorce, but I wasn't surprised because the marriage had been in trouble for at least a decade. But I showed up on Palm Sunday in Jerusalem, a broken man. I went straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, fell down before the altar on Golgotha, and just said, Lord, have mercy. And that week, the worst week of my life, the Lord showed me small miracles that allowed me to know that he would not leave me, that I was in his hand no matter what was coming. And I returned to Budapest just full of hope and life, even though I was facing the worst thing I'd ever faced. And God, that's how our God is. If you have your I had my eyes open for it, I think, because I'd been smashed by events, and I was just desperate and longing for some sign of God's presence. And boy, did he give it to me.
Wow. It's just a great lesson, just that going back to enchantment, resonance, when you give up control, when you're smashed, you kind of have no control. You're just left on the side of the road, and that's where grace can really work. So I think, I think the testimony and just the level of depth you're able to offer is really needed now. So
well, thank you.
I really appreciate it, Rod. It's been just a joy sharing this time with you, and I hope we'll do it again. I'm curious what your next book will be. I wonder if it's,
me too. Yeah, I've seen the changes in Washington happening. I mean, J.D. Vance is a personal friend. I was the one who introduced him to his first instructor in the Catholic faith, and he invited me to come up when he was received into the Catholic Church.
Wow.
And standing there with him. He's a serious Catholic. And now that he's the vice president of the United States about to be, and I'm wondering, should I be in D.C. watching what happens? But I was thinking,
possible cabinet position, maybe?
No. I'd have to hate, if I joined the government, I'd have to hate myself even more. But I was thinking, when I think about Washington now, and I used to live in Washington when I started my journalism career, and I loved it back then. I was going to the airport today to fly to Amsterdam from Budapest, looking at this beautiful city I live in that took me in after my marriage ended. And I thought, do I really want to leave this kind of beauty to go to a place that I think of as ugly and is filled with nothing but power? I don't really think so. And so I'm going to have to decide that. I mean, there could be a book in what's happening in Washington now, but writing Living in Wonder and having lived through this stuff makes me realize how much I need beauty. I need to live around beauty, and Europe has it. And I'm just really blessed to be able to live there now. My older son came over here with me after the divorce. He's in graduate school in Vienna now, and both of us, he's in museum studies, so both of us have been so profoundly affected by the beauty of the built environment in Europe that it's going to be hard to go back.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, even being just this recent visit to Rome, it does that whole feeling of resonance. I mean, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard in just this sort of suburban kind of strip mall, you feel there's no resonance there. It feels very transactional, just kind of, this is just stuff very, very, whereas you go to a place in Europe where things were created with a real, you talk about architecture in the book as well, where it's tapping into some objective kind of pattern in that actually affects the soul. That recovering all of that, and you see that in Europe more so because a lot of these buildings were built at a time when there was still a sense of that enchantment. So I get it that it would be difficult to leave once you've been there for a couple of years and have had a time to allow your whole body, your whole system to kind of adapt to that.
We are so much, it was just impossibly richer than they were in the medieval era when they built Chartres and Reims and the old Gothic cathedrals. Could we, for all of our knowledge and all of our wealth, build a building that would even approach the glory and majesty of those Gothic cathedrals? I don't think so.
I know. No, I don't think so. I don't know if you get this feeling. I remember when I was in New York, there would be, and this is even a smaller little example, I remember living in Astoria, Queens, and you'd have an old kind of Italian bakery, and next to it you'd have something that looked like an Italian bakery, but it was an invented sort of idea of an Italian bakery, and one felt real and one felt sort of invented, and there's a kind of like taking older forms and putting them together in this sort of postmodern way, and you know it's fake, and it's like a Disneyland feel, and you could kind of see how these older sort of places were kind of dying out to these new sort of this kind of postmodern, merely external semblance of something that would no longer exist. That always made me feel kind of sad. The coffee was good, but there was something about going to that older place that had been around for 150, 200 years that felt like, hey, this is real. There's something substantially real here. I don't know if you get that feeling ever, but
I know we're trying to wind up here, but because when I hang up, I'm going to go out in the streets of Amsterdam tonight and find something to eat. Nice. This is one of my favorite cities to walk around in. It's such a beautiful city. But I'm reminded of this Elvis Costello song, All This Useless Beauty, because beauty is useless, I mean, in a strict sense, but I mean, it's a beauty that people don't seem to be able to recognize it. It points beyond itself to God. And this is a thing that is such a tragedy in Europe. They have beautiful churches like we can only dream of in the United States, and they're mostly empty. So there's got to be something more than just beauty.
That's true. Yeah. Well, until next time, Rod, we'll do it again and find more to talk about. But again, grateful to your time, and good luck finding a nice evening pancake or something out there.
Thank you, Tim.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Bye.